Good evening and welcome to tonight's Missing Middle information session focused on planning for growth. I'm Christian Dorsey, Vice Chair of the County Board, and pleased to be your host tonight. This is the last in a series of 3 information sessions that we've conducted. These sessions also represent one of the many ways for residents to engage with information about the Missing Middle Housing Study as the County Board deliberates potential zoning changes. For more opportunities and to learn about how previous input has been incorporated over the 3 previous years of the study, we encourage you to visit the project's webpage at arlingtonva.us. Now, localities around the region and country are exploring how to create more flexibility for expanded housing choices. And increasingly, states and now the federal government, led by the Council of Economic Advisors, are calling for greater housing production to address historic shortages in the housing market. The County Board's consideration of changes to our own zoning code reflects these national demands, but it must be implemented in a way that is consistent with our local values and needs. My colleagues and I are using these next few months to better understand the challenges and the opportunities associated not just with our status quo, but with the possible array of changes that are up for consideration. Now, the most important thing I must start with tonight is at this point in the process, the County Board has not voted on nor scheduled consideration of any ordinance changes. Our staff is analyzing potential amendments to the zoning ordinance and will be doing so throughout the fall. And we will learn from both their work, our conversations with the community, and information sessions like this as we determine what, if any, policy decisions are made in the coming months. Before we launch into our session tonight, focused on growth and planning for it, I'd like to provide some history and background on the Missing Middle Housing Study. In 2015, as part of the Affordable Housing Master Plan, the county adopted a policy to explore more housing options within our neighborhoods that currently only allow single household dwellings. To implement that policy, the board requested that the Missing Middle Housing Study be initiated in 2019. Now, this is just an element of one of the 6 pillars under the Housing Arlington umbrella and explores if various housing types could potentially help Arlington's limited supply of housing, the choices and types of living arrangements that people would have, and the range of prices that housing is available in. Now, the Missing Middle Housing Study began with extensive research into our regional economic conditions, the history of housing and zoning in Arlington, and our existing land use policies. And over the past 2 years, the county staff, along with partners from the community who included organizations and neighborhood associations and individuals, all provided feedback, and that has shaped the scope of the recommendations and the course of the study that we have seen to date. Last year, the board asked staff to identify housing forms that, if allowed in Arlington County, could possibly offer desired alternatives to the current predominant mode of 5 and 6 bedroom and perhaps more single household dwellings that are currently being built when older homes are torn down, and that sell for prices that are out of reach for most households. The draft framework offered by staff is intended to offer insights about the possibilities. And we learned that if we were to expand the type of housing options that could potentially be built, the cost of these homes would vary based on a number of factors, including style, size, location, and market forces. Our hope for these information sessions is to continue to explore and learn about the different aspects of housing, zoning, and growth, and related policies and issues as we consider options that might expand the types of housing that are available at different price points and that increase opportunities for home ownership that could help Arlingtonians of any age. Tonight's session is an opportunity for us to explore a topic in depth with our special guests, and tonight's topic is planning for growth. How does Arlington plan to accommodate a growing population? And specifically, how do we deal with having enough space and seats for our students, sufficient infrastructure, emergency services, and ample parks and open space? What about the transportation options that are available to house and accommodate a growing population? And when the county staff, along with our advisory commissions and the county board, considers changes to the zoning ordinance or a site plan, how do we actually reference and consult pre-existing plans? And how are those updated when more people move into the county and when circumstances change? So, before we get started, let me go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. I am excited to welcome Chuck Bean, who is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments and also an Arlington resident. We're also joined by Nora Palmatier, who is a longtime Arlington resident and one of our foremost resident environmental stewards. Welcome, Nora. We also have John Chadwick, who is the principal at the DLR Consulting Group, but he's known to many of you as the former Assistant Superintendent of Facilities at Arlington Public Schools. And we're also joined by Ron Carley, who is currently an assistant professor at Old Dominion University, but is known to us all as a former county manager in Arlington and also as a city manager in Charlotte in North Carolina. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited that you could be a part of this conversation. I couldn't imagine a better panel of individuals to discuss this topic of growth, sincerely. So before we get into it, I would just like to provide each of you with an opportunity to tell us a bit about yourself and what brings you to wanting to help our community work through this conversation about thinking about growth and thinking about the future. And I'll start off with Chuck.
Yeah, Christian, great to be here with you all. At the Council of Governments, we're a hub for regional collaboration throughout the metropolitan area, so suburban Maryland and the district and Northern Virginia. We're also the federally designated metropolitan planning organization, and as the MPO for the region, we're focused on transportation planning, environmental planning, and as a hub for collaboration, we bring all the police chiefs, all the fire chiefs from throughout the region. Maybe for this discussion, we bring all the housing directors together every month, all the planning directors to look at forecasting for jobs, population, and housing.
Excellent. Thank you. And Nora, how about you?
Well, I'm here for both personal reasons and for the trees. I mean, my spouse and I live in a 75-year-old house, and we're 75 ourselves, and we're discussing which is going to go first, the structure of the house or our knees. And we've looked at all the options of where do we move, how do we retrofit the house, and realize that some of the thoughts of the missing middle, if we could do a duplex in our house, we could make it accessible so that we could age in place, and we could get my nephew and his family on the other side to provide that care that, you know, as we age that we're going to need. Also, I could get him to do all the heavy lifting and yard work. So that's the personal part of it. On the other side, I'm really interested in how could we change a lot of things that go on with lot coverage, setbacks, et cetera, to make any housing area more fit for trees and for the whole environmental issue. There's lots of ways that we could change what we've got now and make it better in the future.
Thank you so much, Nora. And John, welcome back to Arlington.
Thank you.
Hopefully you've had a chance to drive through the county and see some of the fruits of your many great labors.
Thank you. So, you know, after 10 years, Arlington kind of gets into your system. I was listening to Ron Carley talk about that too. And I really care about kids. That's why I do schools and why I care about schools. So I'm happy to come back and give you some benefit from my experience. But also, since I left Arlington working with the DLR Group, I am working on new schools and particularly on the intersection of planning for large school districts, along with energy and climate and how all those things come together. So always interested in what's going on in Arlington.
Great, great. We look forward to that expertise coming through tonight. And Ron, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Ron is not in studio with the rest of us, but he is joining us. We're grateful, joining us from Richmond, Virginia. So take it away, Ron.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm coming to you tonight from Norfolk, Virginia, my home office, here where ODU is, but there's no telling where you'll find me from one moment to another. I do regret that I cannot be there with you tonight. The studio that you're in actually was, most of it, once my office in the late 1980s and early 1990s when I was Director of Human Services in Arlington. When I came in 1980, I came and visited Arlington for the first time. In late '79, I'd moved to Washington to work for a member of Congress, which lasted 1 month, which was about 30 days too long. It turns out I'm allergic to Congress, and Congress was allergic to me. And I found myself unemployed living in the district on unemployment insurance from Alabama, about $75 a month less than my rental in Washington. And so I was looking for a job. Came over to Arlington, and I've got to tell you, in 1980, it was not impressive. The main street was shabby, to say the least. Both Wilson Boulevard and Columbia Pike, you had lanes that changed on rush hour to get people in and out of the county as quickly as possible. The major shopping, of course, was Parkington. My mother had been a retail clerk at JCPenney's, and she said the JCPenney's at Parkington was absolutely the worst JCPenney's she'd been in her life. I really didn't want to come to work for Arlington, but I needed a job. I took it, thought I'd be there for a couple of years and go somewhere else. I ended up staying in Arlington about 6 months shy of 30 years, beginning as a budget analyst and leaving as county manager. And the reason I stayed is because once I got there, I learned what the vision was and what their plans were for Arlington, developed by brilliant people in the 1960s and 1970s, and with subsequent leaders staying with it. And so I was there for the generation that saw Arlington become a place where most people wouldn't want to live, to be a place today where everyone wants to live.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. And it's useful for this conversation to be reminded that growth may be moderate or incremental, but change can be substantial, particularly when you're talking over generations. So we welcome you to this conversation. But to start off, Chuck, I'd like for you to just set the regional stage for a little bit, because we exist, Arlington, within a dynamic region that is attractive to lots of people who want to come here. And I'd love for you to give us a sense of what are the regional factors influencing that growth and how Arlington really fits into the puzzle in terms of receiving a portion of that growth.
Sure. Short answer, the factor is jobs. So jobs has driven the growth, jobs drives population, and population drives the need for housing. If I go back historically, Arlington doubled in size in the 30s, doubled again in size in the 40s. I mention that now because I think it bears some examination. What patterns were set in that rapid growth between 1930 and 1950? Now, in the subsequent decades, Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's in the 50s and 60s, they all doubled and doubled again. That's where growth happened. We can kind of see consistent ballpark 600,000 residents being added to the regional footprint almost every decade except for the 70s. Now we get to this last decade, 660,000 people were added between 2010 and 2020. Go back to my short answer, why? Because of jobs. So looking out over the next decade, we forecast an additional 400,000 jobs in our region. That drives the demand for population and the need for housing. So we predict about 600,000 additional residents coming to our region over the next decade. The factor coming for jobs, the economic vibrancy of this region.
Great. And so within that, Arlington is a place that is built, transit-oriented communities is a matter of, past planning vision and current planning implementation is likely going to receive a fairly healthy share of jobs that would come to the region.
Yeah, we talk about transit, and we've analyzed the nodes of all the we call them high capacity transit station areas. Just 10% of the region's landmass, but they will expect to receive about 55% of all future jobs. So where there's high capacity transit, those are like high opportunity areas. So those jobs will need a place to sleep at night. And that's the challenge our region is facing.
Well, certainly we know that when one of the more recent jobs centers chose Arlington as a place to grow, Amazon, another factor that was not insignificant was the quality and the investment in public education. So John, can you talk a little bit about the role of schools and school facilities in a community's ability to grow and to attract interest?
Well, during my time in Arlington, I met a lot of young families, and many of those families had moved from DC or from somewhere else specifically for the schools. And I know that from what was going on at the time when that employer came to Arlington, that was a major consideration. And I think you have to really look at, as you look at population growth, how much of that is school-age children. So you might have a low, like you said, 1% or so over the last 20 years. Well, there were times when it was 5 or 6% a year for school kids. So you really have to drill into those numbers and see who it is. So we had a major impact on the schools. And when we were chatting with Nora before, there's street after street in Arlington where families have turned over, or older people have moved out or on, and they've turned back to families with kids. And it's just a pattern that keeps repeating because Arlington is a really nice place to live, and a lot of people stay here for a long time.
It's terrific. Now, I have lots of questions that I want to get through with all of you, but also as part of these information sessions, we do provide an opportunity for people who are watching to submit questions, and I'd invite you to do so by either calling or texting your questions to 571-348-3053. That number is at the bottom of your screen. We welcome you to get in, but I'm gonna monopolize the floor for a little while longer because Nora, in addition to the people who may want to come, whether it's because of jobs or who see it as a great place to bring a family because of schools, communities all over deal with that level of dynamic, but part of what influences growth are people who are committed to staying here. And you have committed to Arlington long term. Yeah. Give us some of the reasons why you're committed to this community.
I guess because I live in a fantastic neighborhood and have good neighbors is always, what's happening to you. Super local is good. But also, I'm very interested and involved in the parks in our area and the natural systems. Since for the last 20 years, I've spent a lot of time volunteering in the parks, taking care of the trees, native habitat. And I find that the staff that I work with is very dedicated to that too. So we go. And what is also interesting is I've served on a lot of these commissions, like for the school, for Cardinal and Fleet, and the Facilities Commission. What was it called? The multi-facilities?
The community facilities.
Facilities, yes. Right. And you find such a mix of people all willing to share their opinion, but they're all involved in how do we keep this sustainable? How do we keep it as a place that we want to live? And notice I didn't say keep it green, because green is not always sustainable. I mean, ball fields that are compacted,
right.
Turf lawns that don't have any native plants in them, the shrubs that are just from China or somewhere else that don't feed insects or birds, that's not sustainable, but it's green. So there's a lot of people out there, with my view, working on this as well.
Terrific. And, Ron, we very much appreciate your personal story of what it was like as a young professional and what Arlington did or did not offer. And, of course, you are certainly responsible for a lot of the things that I think have attracted and retained residents like Nora. But I'd like to ask you, based on your experience as a county and a city manager, because for those of you who don't know, we're talking about moderate growth in Arlington of between 1 and 1.5% on an annual basis, but then you went and were city manager at a place that was growing a lot more dynamically than that in Charlotte. So what are some of the things that a community needs to do in order to effectively plan and manage the kind of population growth that's coming for whatever reason is driving it?
Well, the planning part of it is really important, and recognizing, as other speakers have said, that we operate in a system. It's not just about the land use plan, it is also about the sustainability plan, the education plan, the facilities plan, the historical preservation plan, the cultural arts plan, all of it working together to envision a community and society as a whole that people will want to live in. And part of that society needs to be a diverse society. This has been a key part of Arlington for a long time, and Arlington has gone through some new revelations about what it means to be a diverse community. It needs to be multicultural, it needs to be racially diverse, and the struggle that we've had for the last 20 years in particular is to be economically diverse. And that's where the issue of housing becomes so critical. How do we get that diversity of housing opportunity that's affordable for the full range of jobs that we will have in Arlington? Not all are going to be $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 a year jobs. People have to clean the Amazon offices. People have to fill the daycare slots. People have to be physical therapists. We've got a whole lot of jobs that are never going to pay the kind of incomes necessary to buy a home of $600,000, $1 million, $1.5 million. I would be frightful to look up to see how much the homes I owned in Arlington are worth today. And so to do that, we have to plan around the whole system. And that takes visionary people on the county board. It takes exceptional staff, and I will add to what some others have said. Arlington historically has had truly exceptional and dedicated staff. But what has made Arlington successful in its planning has been the continuity. There's not been dramatic shifts one way or another. The board has worked together, the staff has worked together, having the council manager plan of government so that you're able to get that continuity and you're able to take the long-term view and not just the view for the next election. And I would say the single most important part for effective community planning, wherever it is engagement with the community. People, I think, have a hard time understanding today how radical the re-envisioning of Arlington was in the 1960s. In fact, I'm still surprised today how radical the re-envisioning of Columbia Pike was, even though I was directly involved with it. And those dramatic changes were possible because the people in the community were involved with it. It takes a lot of work. All these meetings you're having, some people are saying, why are you having these? You're just going to do whatever you want to do in the end. Well, that's just not true. I can't tell you how many times I've sat at the dais in Arlington as county manager around some development plan or change in zoning and not knowing what the votes were until the votes were taken, because board members didn't know how they were going to vote until they had the public hearings and listened to people. Engagement matters in Arlington. And I know there's a tendency to be cynical these days, but people can have an impact if they will involve themselves.
Well, thank you for that. And you all have hinted that when you think about planning, it's should be self-evident, but bears repeating that this is not about today, and it's not even really about tomorrow. It's about some increment moving forward in the future. And so, Chuck, as you began the conversation telling us what the next 10 years look like, but planning on a regional level goes beyond just 10 years, right?
Yeah, we do forecasts for the next 25 years. And I mentioned being the Metropolitan Planning Organization. In fact, that entity, Transportation Planning Board, does a 25-year transportation plan that's built on these forecasts of jobs, housing, and population. You mentioned Amazon a moment ago, and I'm remembering back to 2018 when our region had 3 sites on the short list for Amazon. 350 places, biggest economic development competition in history. When there were 3 places, one in Maryland, one in the district, and of course Virginia, I thought, well, this is probably going to happen. We need to get moving on this. And I think the impulse at that time was congestion. What's this going to mean for transportation? Very congestion focused. So we brought the director of the Seattle Department of Transportation to speak to our planners and to the COG board. And expecting him as director of transportation to talk about transportation, he did about 40% of the time. About 60% of the time he focused on housing, that was the key. And that's really gotten our thinking, along with some scenario planning. If we want better transportation outcomes, focus on housing. Build the housing closer to these job opportunities. Otherwise, a lot of folks are facing 2-hour commutes, and that's no good for transportation. It's no good for sustainability and for quality of life. So more housing closer to the jobs has been something we really focused on in the last 3 years.
And Nora, you know, your personal story of what makes you interested in perhaps a duplex, the kind of circumstance that allows for you to age in the community that you've called home, to maybe invite family members to share in some of the opportunities for home ownership. You know, it's a different way of thinking than has been the way sort of communities have developed over the last 25 years or so. You know, I shouldn't say that.
Immigrants
not,
always have.
Right, and let's talk about that, because we're really thinking about the future. And, you know, you think that the kinds of circumstances that you desire are kind of going to be a little bit more common than perhaps they've been.
I think so.
Yeah.
Let me first add on what Chuck was saying. I recently visited my niece in Seattle, and she and her partner just purchased a duplex, half of a house, and loved the older family next door. And it turns out that that particular area of North Seattle is zoned multifamily housing only. And right across the street is single-family homes. And we did a lot of walking between them. And of course, I was looking for the trees. And I was pleased that there they had managed to have the same tree coverage in both places. So that made me feel, oh, I could have my nephew on the other side. Well, part of my thinking is that my niece-in-law is an immigrant. And it's very traditional in her culture that she lived with her grandmother and parents and aunts and uncles. And so whenever we were talking, I was thinking, well, you know, this might work. And I think, and it used to be the old way of doing it, you know, back in the 1900s. So I think it is going to happen. And since I've been talking with other friends my age, and they'll say, oh, I was thinking I'd have to move out and leave my house to my kids so that they could live there. Maybe we could do this too, because the thought of building a McMansion with 6 bedrooms and having to share a kitchen just doesn't appeal to me. But a duplex I could deal with. So I think it's going to happen.
All right. And John, you know, Arlington schools, you know, went through a period of time where, you know, we were adding lots of units to the county to accommodate those professionals who were working in the occupations. Not seeing a lot of students come from that population growth, but then it was the redevelopment in some of our existing neighborhoods with homes of bigger sizes that were driving a significant amount of the school population growth. So the question generally is, how do you wrap your head from a planning perspective for schools, how to get ahead of it so that you're not just simply doing mathematical projections based on past history, but getting more into forecasting what is likely to occur?
Well, it's a bit of an art. And I used to get a little frustrated because people would expect it to be, your projections, they're going to be 100% on art. No, they're not. It's a projection. It's a projection. So that was a little bit frustrating. And I know my former colleague, Lisa Stengel, is continually collaborating with county staff to make it consider more things, to get online, housing developments coming online, looking at birth rates. But I want to challenge you on one thing, and that is it really wasn't that much the new developments that were bringing students in. It was the turnover of single-family homes.
Right.
Because, as we said before, Arlington's a place people stay, and so there are neighborhoods that have turned over. You mentioned your street, right? Norma, give me the numbers.
My street, whenever we moved in 35 years ago, had, I don't know, maybe there were like at least 10 kids that went to the Arlington public schools, many of them little rugrats. Well, they all grew up and graduated and are far away. And then we went through a period of just us senior olders living there, but within the last 10 years, it's turned young again. And I counted the other day, there were 25 public school kids on the block. So it went from 10 to 0 to 25. And there's no more houses. There's larger houses where they knock down little ones like mine and put up big ones, but it's still single-family homes.
So one of the planning factors we do look at is housing generation rates. So you keep great statistics that we use on housing types, and then we, because we know where all the kids are, we can check what the generation factor is of kids per housing type. And we would continually look at the generation rate from single-family homes, and it was a great deal less. I can't remember the exact numbers, 40, 50%, 0.4% in other words, generation per house. Some of the communities around us, like Loudon and some parts of Fairfax, it's 80.
Right.
So that actually suggests there's a lot more room for growth if all of those houses turned over. They won't, but it's still a very low number. And then we would also see, well, how many are we getting from high-rise apartment buildings? It's virtually none, because it's mostly young people and children aren't generally in those. We'd look at townhouses, we'd look at garden apartments, we'd look very closely at the affordable housing, and there's a big distinction between the certified affordable housing that is built new by developers. It's not that affordable, and they limit the number of family members who can live in a unit of a certain size, as opposed to the market rate affordable housing, some of the garden apartment complexes, where because it is so expensive to live in Arlington, families are living one per room.
Right.
So we kept very close tabs on those numbers, and that was a huge collaboration with county and schools to just see what was happening.
And it bore out in the results. You could have a high degree of overall accuracy. It becomes less precise as you're thinking on the neighborhood level. But this kind of planning has informed the number of seats that you help spearhead the school system developing, which remind us, how far into the future was that planning process designed to take us?
Well, the enrollment projections when I started were done for 6 years in advance, and now they're done for 10 years, and they're done with a lot more thought, as we just mentioned. But then something like COVID can happen, and that completely threw everything off. And so we grew from about 18,000 students in about 2007, 2008, and we're now around 27,000. That is humongous growth for a school district. And we sort of managed it. Obviously, relocatable classrooms were part of the solution, and we built a lot of schools. But right now, I checked with my colleagues, and it's pretty flat, and it's projected to be pretty flat. But the projections really aren't very good, because they're partly on a 3-year, rolling number. So people moving out during COVID, taking their kids somewhere else, having their kids still in school here or school somewhere else. It's really hard to account for that.
Indeed.
Christian, can I
Please,
just
yeah.
pick up on that? Something Ron said earlier is we need to think about this as a system of systems. And the wonderful schools that we have in Arlington, the facilities, it's got to have a vibrant economic base, and that relates to the planning. And I think major decisions made by the county board, going back a generation and a half ago, creating that Roslyn-Ballston corridor, creating all that value. John would know better than I, but I'm not sure there's other counties in the country that have locally generated revenue that would fund these magnificent $100 million high schools. So it's part of a planning system, picking up on Ron's earlier point.
Indeed.
Yes, because we need to remember that in Virginia, schools are all built with local dollars, as you well know.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about population for, a minimum 25-year outlook. Schools, we're looking at a 10-year outlook. And all of these perspectives, along with the vision that the community is ever iterating, all goes into what we put together in Virginia, the comprehensive plan. And this is not a pro forma exercise in Arlington. We take it quite seriously, don't we, Ron?
Well, indeed we do. And I think one of the challenges historically when I was there is getting all the pieces really to fit together. Sometimes the different components of the plan went different tracks. Over the last 10 years, I think Arlington has integrated them a lot better. And there's some really good materials, some graphics that are available on the Arlington website that shows the interrelationships of the different plans. I wanted to mention about Amazon. That's come up a couple of times, and one of the things that was attractive about the Crystal City, Pentagon City area, of course, is Longbridge Park. Longbridge Park planning started in the 1980s and had to be sustained at least across 6 different county managers. It's a good illustration of how you have to take the long view and have a vision and keep working at it. That was one of the hardest projects that you can possibly imagine because of complex ownership, because of contamination, a whole host of things. That's probably one of the projects in Arlington that would have been the easiest to never do. And look what we have now. When I come up that way, I usually come on the train, and I always get a thrill as the train goes by Longbridge Park. But even bigger than that, Amazon effectively backfilled the massive losses that Arlington took in BRAC in 1906, 1907, and 2006, 7, and 8. Arlington was the most heavily impacted community in America, losing around 20,000 jobs and 4 million square feet of commercial lease space. That's more than most cities have in their downtown completely. And what did Arlington do? We started a 50-year vision of what Crystal City and Pentagon City would be. And that work in the late 2000s, going into 2010 and after, truly laid the foundation for it to be the most attractive place on the East Coast for Amazon to land.
And Ron, when it comes to the work that goes into implementing these plans, whether they be through the comp plan or others, a vehicle that we do it is through our capital budget, and particularly the capital investments that we make that are publicly financed through bonds. These take a time horizon or are projecting over a time horizon that reflects the nature of the investment. So 30 years or beyond is what goes into thinking about those dollars that may be spent today in terms of what they need to be able to accommodate moving forward into the future, right?
Very much so. And the facilities that are especially important, I think, in this context are those we don't talk publicly too much about because they're not very sexy. And that's the water sewer system, really having the infrastructure that can accommodate whatever new form of development that we have. And the real danger, one of the real dangers in the capital planning that I was always very sensitive about is trying to do too much too fast and not leaving capacity within the bond, within your bond capacity, within your debt service to be able to respond to unforeseen things in the future. The plans are plans, and the reality of the future is going to be different. And how do we build in some flexibility and capacity and agility to make adjustments to things that we can envision today?
So, I want to The next part, I think I need to maybe issue a caveat because this conversation has largely been cheerleading for Arlington, and I don't think we should apologize for that. You know, you've contributed to great work for this county. We residents enjoy the fruits of that labor. But part of this conversation when it comes to zoning reform or potential options for new housing types brings to people's mind the concept of change. And I think it would only be fair to acknowledge that people process change differently and have different tolerance for change. And I will take it as a testament to everything that you all have said that is positive about Arlington, that people are worried about having deleterious changes that are not reflective of the kind of progress that Ron spoke about earlier. So I just love to get your thoughts on that, how you kind of view the notion of growth and change from your individual and professional perspectives. And John, let me start with you on this one.
Well, I think I've got two observations. One is nobody could have really done anything about those single-family homes that were sold to families with kids who had more kids, you know? So there's nothing you can do about that. You can try to control it, but I don't know how you do that. And the other thing is, you know, I met a lot of people in Arlington in the 10 years I was here. Almost everybody's moved to Arlington from somewhere else, and they moved because it was a great place to live, and many of them stayed much longer than they might have stayed in other communities. And they all had a sort of image of Arlington when they moved there, and that was what they wanted. But everybody else has moved since then, and even the people that are moving this week have their idea that Arlington is now. So it's always going to change. You can only control change so much, and I really like what Ron was just saying about planning has to have flexibility in it, otherwise it's no good because things will change. So those are my two contributions to that conversation.
Thank you, John. And Nora, I'm going to go to you next and followed by Ron.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot with friends, and so far everyone's been, oh yeah, you could put a duplex in, that'd be great. No bigger than a single family house, that'd fit fine in the neighborhood, go ahead. But whenever you think about, oh, what if I tried to put a fourplex or a sixplex there? Then you run into, how is this really going to work out? Is the sewer going to hook up right? And especially if you think about in 2007, how's it going to fit out there? Is there going to be enough sewer space and stuff? And concern about the parking and all of that. Now, I think that can be figured out, and I would love to see fourplexes and sixplexes all over. I mean, I walk past Westover all the time. Doesn't bother me at all those apartments that are about 3 blocks from my house. So it can be done, but I hear people's worry about it. Of course, maybe they should just come to Westover and see how we do it.
There we go. All right, Ron, over to you.
I want to go to Westover now and go to live in East Ravenna. So change is inevitable, and as human beings, we are pre-wired in support of the status quo, because changing the status quo requires making a decision, and the decision can be wrong, and we hate to be wrong, so we just stay with things even if it's not working very well to us. And so the question, I actually do some training on this, I'm in the morning as a matter of fact. The question I ask people to ask is this: if you were starting all over again today, would you do it this way? And if not, then it's really worth examining, you know, what would you do differently and why? And I have to say on the duplex question and trying to bring some increased density in some of the single family neighborhoods, we've done that before. I mean, there are some lessons there. It didn't necessarily create affordable housing. I lived in the Glebe in 07 at the very tip end of Arlington, and there are a number of townhouse developments in what was one time basically farmland. And it was a new form. It was very expensive form, and it's very expensive form today. It did bring in some increased density. And so one of the questions that's really important to ask as you know you're going to have to change, and you know that some people are going to not like it, People have been opposed to every change that Arlington has ever made. I can show you the scars. The question to ask is this: what problem are we really trying to solve? And I would suggest to you, if the issue is affordability of housing, I think it is at least equally important to look at issue of housing subsidy as much as it is land use. Subsidies have been a part of every housing initiative forever in this country, and every wealthy person living in Arlington gets a larger subsidy than every person living in affordable housing in Arlington through mortgage tax breaks. And unfortunately, it falls to state and particularly local governments to provide the affordability subsidies that are necessary for lower income and middle income people. And if what we want in Arlington is an economically diverse community, looking at all of the options and not just a little bit of tweaking in some of the single family neighborhoods is really important to take that broader view.
Well, Ron, if you want to have a conversation about the regressive impact of the mortgage interest tax deduction, I'll invite you for that conversation. We'll do that another time. I'm sure it'll be highly viewed in our community. But so much rich stuff there. I want to pause for a little bit because, part of what we're hearing concerns from individuals, not just about change, but if you want to have an interesting barroom argument in Arlington, bring up the word density and then ask for people's responses. There are some people who, automatically see it as a tool to create societal good, and other people view it as a plague to be avoided at all costs. I just love to hear your perspectives on it as both a professional and a resident of whatever community you're in. How are you viewing density? And I'll open it up to anyone who just wants to respond.
Well,
I'll jump in on this one.
Yeah, you start off, Ron. Go ahead.
Because the most striking discussion I had on I saw on density in Arlington was not a discussion about density, and it was on the re-envisioning of Columbia Pike. And in that effort, we intentionally didn't talk about densities or FAR or any of that kind of obscure stuff that nobody, what's like 1.7, 3.0 FAR? Nobody knows what that is except a few people in Arlington. But most people don't, and they don't care. The re-envisioning of Columbia Pike focused on form as opposed to density. And if we had talked about density, I don't think we would have ever gotten the form that we got on Columbia Pike. But because people were talking about what they wanted the pike to look like, and they were seeing pictures of it in real time in charrettes and in extensive activity that went on down there, I think we were able to dramatically change Columbia Pike, which needed a real shot in the arm. And so I think how the conversation is framed is really critical so that people know what they're talking about and not talking abstractly.
Interesting. Any other thoughts on that?
I think the way that I hear that question, I think of, ready to geek out on planning a bit. When Ron started, I think the plans were live somewhere, work somewhere else. And so it was the spokes in and out. And then, during Ron's tenure and throughout the country, transit-oriented development, which meant mixed use, live and work in the same place as possible. So one of the challenges with that is the affordability, the appreciation of that real estate around these high opportunity areas. So I think this next way we need to get into is mixed use and mixed income. So that housing is imperative in that sense, so that there's housing availability at different price points. Not just the 200,000 jobs that somebody mentioned before, but at different price points. So yes, we've often said for years, police and firefighters and teachers can't afford to live here, but through the pandemic, I'm glad that those grocery store workers at Centro, at Harris Teeter on Columbia Pike were there to serve us. But we need these different price points of that housing availability close to the jobs.
Right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think density in many people's mind is confused with having nature close. That there's a sense of, if you live in a high-rise building right across from a big park, you don't think you're dense because you can walk out your door, see trees, see flowers, see butterflies. Whereas the farther away you are from nature, the more you don't feel good, that it's not good. I mean, we have that whole thing about biophilia, which the county signed that it is a member of the biophilia network. But to me, what it is that every child in Arlington should be able to open their window and hear a bird sing, whether they're in a high-rise, a duplex, a single-family home, and that we have to work at having nature around every building, apartment, so that when you go out, you don't feel like there's only people and concrete. That's what I think people get confused about density.
So let me say something about schools.
Yes.
So as you know, we built a few schools in the last 10 years, and we went through heavy community engagement around it, and sometimes it was grueling, but we always learned a lot, and it was better for the process. But one thing we heard time and time again is, particularly with elementary schools, families want to live within walking distance. And the more families that live within walking distance, the fewer buses we have on the roads and all of those benefits. So that density brings benefits. And I was always a little amused when we were talking about the Fleet School and the expansion of the Career Center into a high school. Because what that allows for people who live in that neighborhood, they will be able to walk, their kids will be able to walk to every school they go to. They'll be walk to elementary school, middle school, and high school. And there's tremendous diversity in that neighborhood. What I feared was that the density and the attraction of that would in the end put the prices up and possibly reduce at least the economic diversity. So certainly from schools, it works well. Now, the problem we have with schools is that we don't have anywhere to put them. And there have been some great things done. I think building on a parking lot at Jefferson was a good thing to do. Building on a field that wasn't really a field at Discovery was good. And we built the wrong building when we first built the building at whatever it was called, Reed School. Reed School, right? And we had the courage to demolish it and build what should be there. So you really have to think. You really have to think about that. Now, there are some great things happening. The Arlington Community High School being able to find space within the Amazon building is fantastic. That's absolutely where everybody should be going. By a transportation hub, the jobs are there. All those things are good. So I would really urge everybody to be open in thinking about where schools go and what amenities they have. We recently did some work on a school in New York City. The school filled the lot and the playground was on the roof. And I'm working on another one now where it's the same. And there's a little piece of space on the side which will also be a playground. But I think we have to look at what the amenities are and do we need all of those? We have them in other places. As you said, Norma, we have fabulous parks in Arlington and all of them are within walking distance of somewhere.
As long as there's shrubs up there around the playground for them to look at.
And they're natives.
Right.
And the stormwater is dealt with as we have been.
There you got it. I'm
And
happy.
I've heard from someone in New York City who's, I don't know if it's the same place, but another school with a similar park situation, and they've said the added benefit is school safety. Kids are removed from street level, which limits the ability for detritus and other things to be found in the parking lot, for people to have access to kids from the street. They love it. So, you know, it's interesting how probably 50 years ago, no one would have imagined that you would put a playground on the roof, but it could become not just something that's necessary because of space, but a desired outcome.
Yeah, if you look at Google Earth, you'll find them all over New York City.
So, you know,
Norma,
go ahead,
Norma
Ron.
and John, I just wanted to point out, Norma and John, we're not talking about density. they were talking about form.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
perfect illustrations of what I was referring
Yes.
to.
Oh, and that's perfect because, you know, we've got another question that I think will require a little bit of unpacking, and it's positing that many argue that population growth is inevitable and beneficial so long as there are high-wage jobs to support that growth. And then there's a second part. But before I get to the second part, I'm going to take prerogative to just unpack that. Many may argue that, but I'm not sure that's what the conversation is in Arlington. You know, population growth I wouldn't describe as being inevitable or value-laden with the word beneficial. In our case, it is the result of planning and projection. So something that is something that you have to manage, or otherwise it manages you. I think that's at least the guiding presumption of the region. And I think in Arlington, we're also, I think, at a different place where we don't just look at jobs as being high wage and then considering them beneficial. We have a desire, a vision for this community, as Chuck, you alluded to, that we have inclusive growth, that it provide an opportunity for people of different income levels. Ron, as you talked about, the contractors and others who serve the Amazon high-wage employees, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense ecologically if they have to commute in from Lorton to come to Arlington to go to work. So there's this whole idea that growth be inclusive in addition to being sufficiently accommodated for by other plans. But leaving that aside, the other question that's embedded there is whether or not there is an ecological impact, and presumably by the question, a negative ecological impact from increasing density. Chuck, I'm going to tee this up to you because today at the Council of Governments, we looked at some interesting data as it related to vehicle miles traveled in the region despite the population growing. There's perhaps an unintuitive correlation or connection to what happened with vehicle miles traveled. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the broader context that you were referring to is looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And it was back in 2008-9, led by elected officials from around the region. Jay Facette, notable amongst those leaders. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we set targets for 2012 and then set a target for 2020 that we would be, as a region, 20% below 2005 levels for greenhouse gas reductions. And we announced today that our region did indeed achieve that target. So some of the factors were a cleaner grid, but to your question, the second was vehicle miles traveled per capita.
Yeah.
So while we grew 660,000 people this last decade, vehicle miles traveled per capita decreased, and that was the second leading cause to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. So, say it again, job or housing closer to jobs is a major factor, not only improving transportation outcomes, quality of life outcomes, because people don't have to spend so much time on an onerous commute, but also has good green outcomes too. Greenhouse gas emission reductions, nor is how I mean green in this context.
Well, green's good in that way. And, you know, I agree with that totally, and I would take exception to that. I'm the only one in my family with a college degree. There's a lot working in as wait staff, you know, the person who checks you in at the medical clinic, et cetera. And they live in Arlington, often in these houses like you were talking about. So let's give them a chance to move in more.
And John, you know, you presided over the design and construction and opening of, I think, one of Arlington's larger capacity elementary schools that also happened to be our first net zero in terms of energy efficiency elementary schools with Discovery, right?
Yeah, Discovery was actually the first school to be LEED certified zero energy. There are multiple zero energy classifications. And it was about 650 students, I think we designed it for. But then we went up, Cardinals about 850, And it is still very unusual around the country to see 4-story elementary schools like we have at Fleet and Cardinal, but I haven't really had people complaining.
Right.
So that is quite revolutionary. We still rarely see it except in urban situations. And the Heights building is on 7 levels. So.
But just illustrative of the fact that you can accommodate a growing population while still reducing your ecological footprint, at least in some areas.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. You're increasing the density of the school. You're applying more urban solutions to schools, to sites that appear to be suburban, so that you can retain more of the space around the site. But I would still say, if Arlington needs to build new schools, it's going to be very challenging to find places to put them, and it will call for great ingenuity and creativity. But I think if anyone can do it, Arlington can do it.
And, you know, Ron, we've talked about this within the context of the region, which is dynamically, you know, growing overall. You know this well, but I imagine the conversation that we have in Arlington today is not a new one. You probably experienced it when you were county manager, where people wanted us to maybe use some levers to stop the growth from coming here and to maybe go elsewhere in the region. Would you give some perspectives on, you know, one, whether that's desirable, or two, whether that's even possible?
Well, I think a very important point that you're making there is that we are an integrated region. And everyone who works in Arlington is not going to live in Arlington, and everyone who lives in Arlington is not going to work in Arlington. And so this is why COG is so important, and the Northern Virginia Planning Commission is so important. We do need to be coordinating throughout the region and sharing the responsibility to provide that full range of housing and to support one another in economic development. You know, if Amazon had not gone to Arlington, it would have been better for Arlington for it to have gone to Montgomery County or DC than any of those other cities. And so working together is really important, and that includes the working on integrated infrastructure. Going to the point that was just being made about the great news about reduction in greenhouse gases. Well, let's don't forget how that happened. It's not just from the density. It's from an extremely robust public transit system. And continuing to invest in Metro and not letting that system deteriorate as it has at different times is vital to Arlington and the entire region. And it is also significantly affected by the investment in walking infrastructure and biking infrastructure. And that is why, once again, I go back to looking at that system. You know, if you may live within walking distance of a school, but if you don't have a safe path to get there, you're not going to walk to school. And so connecting our nodes together so that people can walk. And I can tell you, when I was there in 1980, you did not want to take a walk down Columbia Pike or Wilson Boulevard because there are missing sidewalks and inadequate sidewalks all throughout the area. And making that investment is important. I just want to make one more point before I forget it. So I apologize for going too long here. In whatever changes that are made, don't give away new options. The genius of those that preceded me in Arlington is most of the changes that have occurred around density and new development have not been by right. You've got to come in and put together a plan, and you've got to sell it to the community. If you do things by right, which I have seen other communities do, Charlotte for one, for instance, almost everything there is by right, you pretty much lose control. And if you have unintended consequences, it's very hard to tweak the system to respond and fix them.
Wise counsel for sure. And, you know, you talked a little bit about the different modalities that are currently important to helping communities thrive, the infrastructure with sidewalks, but the bike trails and, you know, the other multimodal connections. I know transportation is a big part of this conversation for the community. They look at any increases, however modest, as being foolish if you don't have sufficient transportation infrastructure. And fortunately, our community is so different from when I first moved to Arlington, where pretty much you thought of transportation in terms of metro rail. But, you know, in Arlington, we have a substantial local bus to supplement the regional bus connections, which also has the rail connection. Those were the most resilient during the pandemic, but most resilient of all are the interconnected systems of trails, sidewalk connections, which enabled people to use active modes to move around. I'd just love to hear your thoughts as people who have been involved in planning and doing the professional work that you do. The transportation is a whole new ballgame, far beyond just metro rail as considering a community to be transit accessible, isn't it?
Yeah, I think from a regional perspective, we got to throw in VRE. And such a big impact, the changes that Virginia, the Commonwealth has made to connect VRE to Metro when we think about the future of Potomac Yards, of future of National Landing. And Maryland, it's MARC. So WMATA, MARC, VRE, and then the active transportation, the walking, bicycling. I think our region is second only to Portland, Oregon in terms of bicycling as a commute option. It pales in comparison to our European metropolitan counterparts, but here on the soapbox for these high-capacity transit station areas that I talked about before, just 10% of the region's landmass, but 55% of the job growth. The verb optimize. We need to optimize the walkshed around all those areas. Half mile, 10 minutes, being able to walk in a perfect radius around that walkshed. So Clarendon and other places are exemplars in that in the region. Now thinking about the bike shed. What's possible in a mile bike shed, maybe longer with electric bikes. Electric bikes are outselling electric cars. So the walk shed, the bike shed. Then I think as we think about this longer term horizon, the micro-transit shed. So I'll start thinking about 2 miles around these nodes of National Landing, of Ballston. Micro-transit, not the big bus, but it might be a small bus. It might be a on-demand app doing 2 mile radius, picking up people, getting them to these opportunities. So the overlay of that transit and the different forms of transportation optimizing, making the streets straight, I think like Ron was saying, brings in that housing overlay that I talked about before, that more housing closer to the jobs, different types, so there's different price points, so it's affordable to different household budgets.
I agree. I was a bike commuter to work for years and years. But one of the issues about transportation that people get so upset about is I'll pull in trees again. And trees are very impacted by transportation. Like even bike routes, you need to have them farther away from the bike routes and stuff so that they don't interfere with it. I've been on several commissions talking about that.
Oh, sure, right.
And then the bike lanes on streets.
Right.
Well, if you put bike lanes in, you may not have enough room for trees to grow on these sides. So there's a fine point of how do we keep it going? And while we're on the tree canopy is a really big issue. People are afraid that they're going to lose even more. It was 41%. It's come down. We haven't done a study recently, but I'm looking at it. And I know the most frustrating part is that tree canopy has increased on public land,
Yes, right.
on parks and on schools. And, a lot of us volunteers have planted a lot of those trees. So somehow we have to get it across that more people, private homeowners, need to take advantage of the tree canopy fund and get a free tree. And now there's a group through Eco Action Arlington, the Tree Equity Program, that I was just out with a group of volunteers on Monday, and we knocked on every single door in that neighborhood of Arlington View and left them a flyer to apply for a tree. So we have to start doing things like that and because the only space we've got left really for trees to grow on is in individuals' homes, the private land, whether it's single family, apartment, or duplex.
So, Nora, if we could, let's go there for a little bit, because I know trees are a foremost concern for a lot of people. And
Yep.
there is, I think, a place where a lot of people go intuitively, that more units means fewer trees. And I know that you have some,
Well,
some
I
further
will
thoughts
say
on that.
since 2008, I've worked with the Tree Canopy Fund on a lot of site visits and tried to get people to take trees. Over half of the trees that we've gotten into places have been at condos and HOAs and apartment buildings. We get a lot more of those, taking a lot more trees than we do single-family homes. It's like, oh, I've got one tree in my yard, that's all I need, where they could really have 3. But for apartments, they're pretty good about putting trees around. One of the things that if more larger buildings are approved in areas, then the lot coverage and looking at all of that, the details, the devil's in the details. How are we going to require more trees? And there's a little bit of a state law about density, but I don't think in Arlington we'd ever hit that density outside of the corridors. So
Indeed.
I think we're okay.
I just point out, we haven't just planted trees in the ground, we planted them on buildings
That's
too.
right. And I was part of that school, like Lover Run. Lover
it's
Run, the
fabulous. Yeah.
community center,
Fantastic.
has all these trees on top of what used to be a parking lot.
Yep.
And we've been pretty aggressive in Arlington, ensuring that redevelopment brings with it some pretty aggressive tree replacement requirements. And it's also an unfortunate consequence that the way developers have pursued redeveloping property in our neighborhoods that are currently zoned for
Right.
low-density residential has been to clear cut a lot of any existing mature canopy before providing whatever it is that they're required. So this is a multi-layered problem, but what I'm
Right.
taking away from you, Nora, is well, it was just the perspective that you have to be intentional to get the outcomes
You
that you
have to
desire.
be, right.
And that's not necessarily going to be
If you want to
dictated
put
by
a
the
bike
type.
lane in, you got to think about how am I going to have trees to shade this road? And we just cut the traffic down to 1 lane.
Makes
That's
it go
easy.
slower.
Right, that does slow
Which
it.
we also do here in Arlington, but you all know that. So a lot more questions, so I'm going to try and prioritize the most salient ones as we think about growth. So for many Arlingtonians, Ron, they go back to the days of when Metro came in and we concentrated growth along these transit corridors. Many people looked at that smart growth as being incredibly effective and innovative. And now we're subsequent generations later, people are wondering how the missing middle proposal fits into either complement or contravene the paradigm that we've had before. And we didn't ask you to be here as a missing middle expert, but I would love to get some top line thoughts about how you see this fitting in with Arlington's growth history.
I think the missing middle needs to be an essential part of the transit-oriented growth. Again, there's nothing wrong about trying to bring some diversity into some of the single-family neighborhoods, but you're only going to have limited capacity there. And so some of the early redevelopment will begin to age out, and there'll be redevelopment of redevelopment in Arlington. And beginning to think about what that will look like in terms of the housing requirements, and I think in terms of the open space requirements. In the early days of redevelopment coming out of the plan, the Metro Plan in the 60s and 70s, we didn't require much with regard to anything. Arlington just really needed investment at that point. And you look at some of the site plan conditions in those early days, I mean, they're like, page. Now they're, tens of pages, if not hundreds of pages at times, much to the dismay of the development community. But the reason the development community has been willing to play in Arlington is because it's so valuable to them. And as redevelopment occurs, we need to fix some of the mistakes. We've been cheerleaders of Arlington tonight, but we made mistakes along the way. And we absolutely did not require enough open space in the transit corridors. and it's going to be hard to fix it, but as redevelopment occurs, that needs to be a major part of that discussion, and looking truly at all of the different components on how we bring diversity of affordability and housing is critical so that people can live in or close to the community where they work for the full range of jobs that are in Arlington.
I'm just laughing because I think it takes us about 3 or 4 pages just to have transit development, transportation demand management part of site plan conditions. So, woo, times have certainly changed.
To schools too.
Yep.
Much to your pleasure, right, John? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm bringing back old scars for you, right?
There weren't scars. Generally, they did the right thing.
Excellent.
It might have been hard getting there, but everyone did the right thing.
No, it's beautiful. So another question that I'd like to get into concerns equity, because you've all talked about it to a certain degree about the vision for the future of being more inclusive than it perhaps has been in the past, and invite you to just come to this from any conversation that you want. But if we accept the proposition that you're not going to get the outcomes that you desire unless you are intentional about them and plan for them, what are some of your biggest priorities as it relates to equity, however you define it, as it comes to future growth to Arlington and to the region?
For the Council of Governments, the biggest initiative on equity is looking at all of the census tracts of the region and analyzing those, looking for concentrations of low-income communities or communities of color. So about 364 census tracts out of the region's 1,300 census tracts have been identified. We call them equity emphasis areas, where we need to take extra focus in all the aspects of planning. So transportation comes first to mind. We think about the jobs juggernaut that National Landing is going to be, but we look at some of these census tracts in South Arlington along Columbia Pike. They might be a couple miles away. How do we connect those census tracts to those opportunities? Well, the same kind of analysis can be done with those census tracts, looking at the region as a whole on roadway safety. Are there more fatalities, more injuries in these census tracts compared to others? And then we can dig deep into why. Is it some aspect of engineering of those roadways? Nora, I just learned about this about a year and a half ago. We can look at tree canopy and compare the tree canopy in these 364 census tracts compared to the region's 1,300 as a whole. And if there's difference, we can start asking why, and we answer that then how. So that's the major focus, is looking at this, I call it an acupuncture chart of equity. It's about 10% of the region's land mass, but 30% of the population lives in these relatively more dense census tracts, and making sure that they're connected to these really nodes of opportunity. That's where it begins.
And it's really interesting that you say that, because I'm now working, or my company, we're working on equity in terms of capital planning, and we do exactly the same thing. In terms of schools, and we're doing this in Boston and Denver and Austin and other places, the research shows that the children who are the most vulnerable will benefit the most from new and improved school facilities. And so should that not be a factor in prioritization of capital spending? And actually, we will do a lot of research into where capital spending had been in the past in relation to those things, and trying to make that a major factor. So, for example, in Sacramento, we did a fairly straightforward plan, and there were 2 types of development. One was exceptional and one was normal. Typically, school planning has been done around enrollment growth and capacity needs and around conditions of buildings. Recently, we've looked much more at educational adequacy. How does it meet the needs of the school district and the vision for teaching and learning? And then adding in these issues of equity, and how, so in Sacramento, as I was saying, most of it was done a more traditional way, but these areas were identified of special need and exceptions. Two low-income neighborhoods are getting brand new schools, where under the old way of looking at things they wouldn't have done, and schools are huge centers of community, and they foster community, they create economic growth in the community, they make communities feel great about themselves because an investment is being made in them, and the spin-off is huge. So I would like to see Arlington start to think that way, and as we look for sites for schools, those would be the sort of neighborhoods where I'd want to look first. And the other evidence we know is that low-income families really want their kids close to home because it makes their lives easier to manage, and it allows them to take more part in their kids' education. If they're working 2 jobs, they're on public transit, they're going where they want their children as close to home as possible.
If I could just pick up on that, the capital improvement program, this is a case where Montgomery County has codified a look at equity emphasis areas into things like the capital improvement program. In these census tracts, the capital program must have proportional investment. Montgomery County, they have a green bank, and they say that 20% of all the investments from this green bank in the county must be in these equity emphasis areas. Think about things that are even more perhaps mundane or matter of fact. Montgomery County has a Shovel Our Sidewalks Act. Well, what's that? Well, that these census tracts need, from a county perspective, need to have their sidewalks shoveled first. Well, why is that? Well, there's a correlation. These census tracts have a population that is less car dependent, more public transportation dependent. And if they're going to get to that transportation, need to make sure that the sidewalks are shoveled. So here's one case. I know when I talk about Maryland County that's doing something really well, it really makes the Arlingtonians' blood boil. But I think on this equity emphasis areas, Montgomery County has something that we could learn from.
No, I appreciate your uplifting it because it's so rare that they do something well over there that I think it merits lifting it up when it happens. So thank you for that.
So going back to my original story, I have to tell you the place I really wanted to go to work instead of Arlington was Montgomery County.
Indeed. Well,
And I'm really grateful I ended up in Arlington County. And so this issue of equity is where most of my attention is focused today, both in the classroom and in work that I do with other local governments. And what I've realized is that we don't really understand it very well. In Arlington and other communities that are progressive, we've just been liberal people with good intention, thinking that we would always do the right thing and not being analytical about it, and not really questioning, well, what is equity? And what is the difference between equity and equality? And what does diversity and inclusion really mean in this context? And we're very early on our journey here. If there were one thing that I could do different if I were beginning my career over again, especially as county and city manager, it would be from the beginning applying an equity lens to all the decisions that we made. And we didn't do that. And we've been oblivious to how systemic inequity is baked in to all of our different systems. And so as we go forward in every one of these areas we've been talking about, we need to explicitly ask the question, who benefits and who is burdened? And are we making decisions that are really fair for all of the people in the community or just some of the people in the community?
Thank you for that, Ron.
Yeah,
Nora.
I have to say that I don't see the missing middle as really bringing equity into anything. The amount that it would cost to build a lot of this stuff, and where it would be, doesn't really strike me as getting at the equity. I think personally there will be a lot of individuals who do the duplex or maybe even a triplex because it fits in with their personal need or something. But the estimate of there being possibly 20 new buildings a year on this doesn't really get to the equity. I mean, equity is so difficult to get to,
Well, it is, and Nora, you bring up the scale of what is projected to be redevelopment that occurs in the missing middle form. is one thing. I think, there's so many elements of this conversation, but the one thing that I think we can absolutely say for certainty is what this proposal would do is to upend what has been the paradigm that roughly 3/4 of our residential land is only and exclusively allowed to be redeveloped in one way.
Right.
And this would provide other opportunities. And
Whose
whether
choice?
to the degree that those opportunities created more options for people who have been marginalized or hitherto been shut out, it is perhaps a step forward in equity. But you're absolutely right. The scale of what is proposed is not going to make ours an equitable community that can rewrite the injustices of the past, for sure.
Yep.
But on the other hand, Ron was pointing out that we plan for the unknown. You don't actually know what all the consequences of this will be. There might be some turn of events that greatly increases the number. We really don't know.
Right. And Ron, go ahead.
And that's why I say, don't let it get away from you. If you're going to try something new, try it, but don't give it away.
Right.
And I mean, one of the risks here is that you take people who are sitting on very expensive property that can only be redeveloped as single family, and they redevelop it into something that's 2 or 3, and they've just multiplied their wealth. And is that addressing any equity issue whatsoever, or just making wealthy people wealthier? It is a really complex issue, and that's why I go back to the comment that I made earlier. Be very careful to define the problem that you're trying to solve.
I wonder if I could pick John's brain on this. You were talking about household size, and where I'm going to on this is the District of Columbia now has about 700,000 people, and there's some thought, doesn't it feel crowded? And the mayor of the District of Columbia has a goal to add 36,000 new units by 2025. But at 700,000 people, that's less than the district had at its apex. It had 800,000 people. So a lot of that was family composition size, the number of people that were in a household.
I would think so.
I just, following kind of Ron's logic here, if the only option is to redevelop bigger, where does that leave us? Whereas the proposition that Nora was talking about, that option to go to a duplex, and 2 families are in there. So I'd be interested in what you comment on household size and how that's changing and how this affects this question.
Well, most of what's being built in DC has been multifamily, which is occupied by 1 or 2 people and very few children. And the DC school population is declining, as far as I know, and they have charter schools as well as public schools. So. And they have the same problem of affordability, just like Arlington does. And I do think there's a lot to be said for the duplexes. Maybe that's where Arlington should start and see what happens. Then you'll be fine, Norman. But I agree with you. It could be too much to go big, and you should be careful what you plan for.
Well, we're going to have to bring this to a close only because the time is nearing the time where we said we would let you go, not because I've exhausted every dimension of this conversation. But I think where we are is exactly where we should be, is an understanding that the term unintended consequences are often used by decision makers to absolve themselves of responsibility for the bad stuff that occurs. But what I think we have built up in Arlington over the years, and it's embedded in the work of the public schools and in the region as well, is that we are trying to perfect the art of planning so that we get to the point where the consequences are not unintended. We get what we plan for, and we have effective ways to, if not ensure the outcome, to ensure that we don't find ourselves at the end of the day having to sheepishly explain away a series of unintended consequences that better planning should have rightly foreseen.
I would challenge that a little bit because unintended consequences can be positive too.
Oh, of course.
So we can keep the positive ones, but not the negative ones.
But we'll take those as gifts and joys. But when you have to stand before people and, rationally explain away all things that were unintended that you could have foreseen had you done the proper work in planning. That is, in my opinion, an abdication of your rightful responsibility. But with that, I feel like it's old home with John Chadwick, who is currently a consultant doing some great work that leverages a lot of his experience in Arlington. Bring back Ron Carlee,
Yeah.
professor who is sharing his knowledge and experience with students, which is terrific. Chuck Bean from the Washington Council of Governments, who should also mention is deciding to end his tenure as chair of COG after more than a decade. You will be sorely missed, and I think you all could see why from our conversation tonight. And Nora, one of Arlington's treasured residents, thank you so much both for your personal story and your passion. And we very much appreciate everybody for joining us tonight. And we appreciate those of you who have viewed for sharing your questions and offering your comments. And this has been such a terrific conversation. I hope that we've given you a sense of how planning for growth and perspectives of change influence the way a community not only deals with circumstances and issues today, but as part of the future. As a reminder, tonight's session was part of a series, the third in a series. The first dealt with housing development and the economic considerations therein. The second concerned the history and the future of zoning and housing policy. And of course, we now have tonight's session in the books, Planning for Growth. All three are going to be available on our website, and you can see the information on how to access that on the screen. Members of the County Board are also, during the month of October, hosting a series of community conversations. And to learn more about those conversations and other efforts associated with Missing Middle, we encourage you to visit our website where you can find a copious amount of information related to this topic, arlingtonva.us. Type Missing Middle in the search box. And with that, I'd like to thank my guests and all of you for watching. Good night. Nicely done. Very
Yeah.